if there's one type of fishing that really means summer, it's got to be tench. Whether you catch them on the float or the ledger, doesn't really matter to me as long as I'm catching, which is easier said than done on some of the big gravel pits that I fish. I mean, my tench fishing's really graduated from small farm ponds, smaller gravel pits that are well stocked, and to be honest, in those kind of venues the tench can be relatively easy to catch. Any time you've got a decent head of fish, even reasonable sized ones, they're generally not too difficult to catch. If they're hungry and they're competing with food with other individuals, then you know they're going to be that much easier to catch and they're going to drop their guard a bit quicker. But my tench fishing's really migrated over a good few years now onto fishing bigger gravel pits, generally with quite low stocks of fish. And the reason being I want to try and catch big ones. And I've been fairly successful. But after a lot of suffering really and a lot of not catching very much. And that's really because I was getting my tactics wrong. And to be honest, before I even started to film underwater, I started to adapt the tactics, learn from reading what other people were doing and catching on, which you know definitely set me on the right path. And a lot of what I've learned over the years has been really now confirmed by some of the underwater filming I've done. So let's start off having a look at a bit of underwater filming and see exactly how tench feed. And these are fish that are, you know, in gravel pits, quite low stock. You'll see there's one or two fish there, but not lots of them. So let's have a look and see what they do. So one of the things that you'll notice is that the tench are cruising around, but then come in, and when they're actually feeding or just moving around near bait, they're very close to the bottom. And I think this is just a natural behaviour that they have. This is nothing unusual. And you know, not feeling for line or anything like that. They just cruise around using the pectoral fins just for fine movements and move really slowly. And this kind of thing has really, this kind of movement has really influenced how I fish for them, and means that I tend to use very short hook lengths these days. So as soon as the fish picks a bait up, it's going to get hooked. Now, if I watch this film, this was a swim that I baited in a small bay that was being visited by a few tench, and you'll notice that early on this was the fish arrived after about an hour of the disturbance of me dropping the camera in and putting some bait in front of it. And you'll notice that they're not actually feeding that hard, they're just cruising around, checking it out, not really confident yet. If we skip forward quite a while now, we'll skip forward another hour or so and have a look at this clip of film. Now what you'll notice now is the fish seem to be gaining a bit of more confidence, especially this male fish that's really starting to get active now and chase, you know, move around a lot quicker, come in, pick up mouthfuls of food. They're definitely getting a lot more interested in what's out there. There's also now less food in front of the camera. Now some of that's because they've ate some of it, but a lot of the time it's just because the fish moving around is creating a bit of a movement in the water, and it spreads the bait out, and they're picking it up and spitting it out and moving it around. So where I a big concentration of bait to begin with, similar really to if you were spotting in a tight patch and putting a lot of bait out, already it's starting to spread out and the fish are having to move around a little bit more to find it. I've skipped forward another hour now, and this is when I think the fish are starting to get really catchable. You'll notice there's hardly any bait visible in the swim now. They've ate quite a bit of it and spread the rest of it out. We've had a shoaler roach come in as well, and they've eaten a bit. And so the fish are active and are looking for food now. They know it's there, they know it's actually food, even though it's hemp and castor that I've introduced. And yeah, now they're really catchable. I think they're moving around a bit faster and paying less attention to what they're doing, and this is where you're going to start getting bites if your rigs are right. And again, they're still not moving around all that quickly, not like a carp or a bream kind of speed, which tends to be a lot quicker. They're still quite slow, so I'm expecting them to, you know, come in, they're picking bait up, spitting it out, sorting the food from the detritus. And so really still I'm trying to use short rigs that are going to, and a good bolt effect, that are going to, you know, prick a fish, hook it as soon as possible. Now a question I get asked a lot is how much bait should I use when I'm tench fishing? And honestly my answer these days is use as little as you possibly can. There's no advantage from laying out a big bed of bait in my opinion. If you're fishing with swim feeders, putting most of the bait out that way, then you can be really accurate. Practice your casting, clip the lines up, and you should be hitting almost the same spot every time. And if you know, what I tend to do is during the day I'll recast every half hour or so, even if I'm not expecting bites, just because I want to put a little bit of bait out. One thing you do learn from the underwater video is that if there's too much bait out there, you give the fish too much choice. They're not feeding really heavily a lot of the time, and I want to have the best opportunity of picking a fish off. I don't want to feed them, I actually want to catch them, and the best way of doing that is to not put too much bait out. I really think that topping the swim up regularly with bait, little and often style, is the way to go rather than piling it all in. Rough rule of thumb, the further out I fish, generally the more bait I use. Not because I'm expecting to catch more fish, but just because my accuracy is not going to be quite as good and it's going to spread out more. So if I'm literally fishing off the end of the rod top, a couple of handfuls of maggots is probably all I'm going to need. That's going to be enough, just topped up every time I get a bite or see an indication of a fish, just to keep the swim topped up and keep the fish interested. But if I'm fishing further out, then the odd spodful is going to go astray. It's definitely going to spread out more than it would if I was fishing in close, so I'm going to up the bait. And what I'll tend to do then is put more hemp out, which isn't really going to feed the tench up so much. So it definitely attracts them, but it's not going to feed them so much. And maybe a pint or two of maggots, but still that'll be spread over normally 2 rods, so we're not talking about a massive amount of bait, big bait bills. It's really about catching them. The great thing with a swim feeder is you've got that source of attraction that's going to bring them to the hook bait. So you don't need to fill it in. If your location's right, they'll be passing you and you'll pick them off as they come through. Looking back to last summer now, I fished a small estate lake a few times and was lucky enough that the water was really gin clear for a change. And so I used one of the small water wolf cameras just in place of a swim feeder to film some of the tench in the swim. And the great thing was the water was only really shallow, about 4 feet deep, and I was only having to fish about 2 rod lengths out, so it was perfect for filming. And to be honest, the results were quite shocking. I was getting, even though I was catching quite a lot of tench from this swim and on this little lake, the amount of times the bait was being picked up and put down was quite incredible. So let's have a look at some of that footage. Now, as you can see, the tench are in the swim all the time, and compared to the low stock gravel pits, this lake is absolutely crawling with tench. They're not very big, they average 3 or 4 pound, but as you can see, there's generally quite a few cruising around, and as soon as you put bait in, one of the good swims, they normally turn up, and you can expect some bites pretty quickly. But what's interesting is still, I don't think fish are particularly tuned into tackle. They're not sussing out rigs and stuff like that. But the way they naturally feed means that anything that's hard, like mono lines, even braid, and certainly hooks, anything hard like that, feels to them as if it's detritus. So as they pick it up, straight away they know it's not edible and they spit it out again. And I think if you're using hard baits like pop-ups, then a lot of time that also counts against you, because again it feels quite hard, it's a bit unnatural compared to a lot of the natural food that they're eating, and so again it tends to be picked up out of curiosity or because it smells nice, but then dropped fairly quickly too. And it was really interesting this morning how many fish were coming into the swim, sampling the bait. Again, the amount of movement they create as they move around the swim was quite incredible, and although I'd raked this swim the day before, even so, the fish were moving bits of weed and algae around, and very quickly the rigs could often, on a lot of casts, get caught up in bits of weed. So that was quite a good learning point really, that if I'm fishing a swim that's raked, it's never as clear as you might expect it to be. And again, that weed moves around, there's still bits of detritus and twigs and stuff on the bottom. So if you're not catching fish when you think you should be, maybe you're seeing them rolling in the swim or whatever, then definitely chance a recast. Drop the rig back in again, and hopefully you might get it in a clear patch where your chances of catching it are greater. And I did catch some fish. Here's one that picks it up and bolts off with it, and another fish in the net. Happy days. But I was really interested in how often, and I think looking back at the whole film, I was probably catching a tench probably 1 out of 5 times that it was approaching hook bait. It was as poor as that, and that's not because I think my rigs were wrong. I don't think there was much more I could have done to improve them really. because on this lake I couldn't swap over to smaller baits because it's absolutely alive with small rudd, and they just demolish anything you put out apart from the boilies. So it's you know, Hobson's choice really. What more could I do? I've got to use the bigger baits for these tench. But again, really interesting observations on how they move around the swim quite slowly, which again I think, you know, explains why the short rigs and the short bolt rigs work so well. Confidence is key if you're fishing difficult waters and not expecting to get many bites. So to be honest, I don't use that many rigs. I don't change anything around very much. I use strong gear, and hopefully every fish I hook is going to get landed. And for most of my tench fishing, that really revolves around 2 different rigs. And most of my tension really revolves around helicopter rigs. There's loads of magazine articles and videos been made about this. It's very, very simple. Short hook length, about 3 inches, and I've positioned that quite close to the feeder, perhaps closer than a lot of people do. Yeah, it's probably only 5 inches away from the feeder. And that's just got 2 rig stops there holding that micro swivel. So when I cast out, it acts like a boom. I've got 10-pound fluorocarbon on here, and the hook length booms away, and helicopters as well, so you're not going to get tangles. Size 10 Dredden Super Specialist hook, and generally I'm going to fish 3 maggots and then a piece of foam shaped like a maggot, so it's going to pop up and the bait will be sat just off bottom, which definitely brings you a lot more bites. Now, a few years ago I went through all my gear and tried to cut down wherever I possibly could on any duplication, and one of the things that did get chucked out was swivel feeders, and instead I use these inline Drennens now for both of the tench rigs that I use a lot. And all I've done is I've threaded the line through it and tied it onto a swivel at the end, pulled it in, so it's effectively the same as a swivel feeder. It means I don't have to carry both styles. A couple of things about the feeders: I generally use the bigger size. I'm not recasting that regularly, so I want to put as much bait out as I can. Generally I'm packing it with maggots, and what I'll do is I'll riddle off any maize or sawdust or whatever that they're in, so I can pack as many maggots in as possible, and I'll really pack them in tight, because that means that they're much less likely to come out on the caster as the feeder's sinking through the water. I've filmed underwater with feeders that I've scratched up to try and make them a bit less shiny, and in actual fact all it generally does is it attracts little gas bubbles, which actually makes them look worse, so I've stopped doing that. The other thing you'll see people doing a lot is wrapping their feeder in sort of camouflage tape and stuff like that, perhaps to reduce the number of holes to slow down the release, or perhaps just to try and camouflage it a bit. There's a problem with that, and the problem is that if you make the feeder darker, a darker colour, maggots in water, or in air as well, will try and get away from light. So rather than come out of the feeder, they tend to stay in it. So yeah, you'll massively slow down your releasing your maggots from your feeder if you darken the feeder up or wrap it in tape. Often to the point where most of the maggots won't even come out. So yeah, just be a bit wary of that. So yeah, feeders are a bit shiny, they're a bit bulky, but what can you do? You can't. You can just go with the best you can get, really. And so that's the rig that I use all the time if I'm casting out into the lake, really, whether I'm fishing on gravel bars or humps or into open water. It's very tangle free and doesn't get hooked up in weed very easily. Nice simple rig, very, very simple. The one downside with that rig, and I've talked about it in previous videos, is that it doesn't work very well if you're fishing the margins. Now you might say, well, why don't you just fish a float down the margins? And yeah, in an ideal world I would, but a lot of the tench venues that I fish are a long way from home, and so I have to go for sort of 2 or 3 trips every few weeks. And trying to concentrate on a float in the margins early in the morning, once you've been on the bank for a day or two, not easy. So if I'm fishing for fun, yes, I'll fish for the float, but again, I'm fishing for big fish, not expecting many bites, and I have to be a bit more ruthless, and that means sticking with the feeder tactics. Not as pleasurable, but there you go. The helicopter will work up to a point, but if you've got a steep shelf fishing close into relatively deep water, which you find on a lot of gravel pits, what will tend to happen is the line will lift up a bit, and even if you slacken right off and use tungsten putty or back leads on it, you still might find that your number of bites are not what you expect on that rig. And if that happens, then I'll swap over. And what I'll do is use something very, very simple again. I've got the same feeder, the big Drennan Oval, the inline version, and this is normally 1.5 ounces or a 2 ounce. Gives a nice big bolt effect. But now I'm fishing it, this time I'm fishing it the way it's originally designed to be used, which is line through. Again, slightly longer hook length maybe on this one. Again, you can use it with pop-ups or bottom baits. If I'm using bottom baits, I'll go a little bit longer, maybe 5 inches, just so it's a little bit easier for the tench to suck up. It's more likely that they're going to be able to suck that bait up. You can use this rig with a pop-up as well, on one of these ring swivels. There's no reason why you can't just pop it up straight like that, right next to the feeder. And again, if I was doing that, I'd be using the 3-inch hook length instead. Big feeders, big tench, wheelie waters, you don't want to be messing about with light lines. So generally I'm using 12 pound. Again, it might sound heavy, but I go fishing to land them, not to hook them and lose them. And the last thing I want to do is only get 2 or 3 bites a year and then not get them in the net. It doesn't really matter anyway, because what I've done is I've put on a length of tungsten rig tube. Now, rig tubing's kind of really gone out of fashion. I don't know many people that actually use it anymore. A lot of people use leg core and stuff like that. But to be honest, I still use this tungsten stuff a lot. It's not, doesn't blend in very well on the bottom, and a lot of the time you'll watch the fish and they'll actually avoid it rather than touch it. But the good thing with it is it is heavy and it will sink. I don't try and attach it to the feeder or anything. I just put a length on, and once it gets damp, it doesn't move very far. It generally holds in position. That's quite a long length. You don't have to use anything as long as that. But the idea is that feeder will go out on the bottom of the marginal shelf. I can slacken off and that will lay on the bottom. Even if it's a bit tight or a bit lifted, I don't think a tench is going to worry about rubbing up against some soft tubing like that, anything like as much as it will against the line. Now you might say, well, why aren't you using a fluorocarbon mainline that sinks a lot quicker? Yes, they do sink quicker, but they tend to be a bit coily, especially if they've been on the reels for a while. You can get big coils coming up off the bottom. Again, not great, especially if you're fishing with really slack lines. So that tends to be my go-to setup, again, if I'm fishing in the margins. Now the leg of this tungsten tubing, again, you can put a length of that above your helicopter rig if you want as well. It's not going to really cut down on the number of tangles. In fact, it might actually increase them slightly, but again, it's going to help pin everything down. And because it's free running on the line, it's not going to cause a problem if you do happen to snap off or whatever. It's just going to run straight off. So that's the 2 rigs. Dead simple. On that one, same. Normally £10 fluorocarbon to a size 10 Drennan Super Specialist. I go on a slightly small hook, maybe down to a 12 if I want just 2 maggots on rather than 3. If I'm using worms, small odd worms or dendrobenas, you can adapt the same rigs. And I tend then to use like the quick stop rig with the worms sandwiched in between. And that's about it. I've refined my terminal tackle down, so I carry very, very little. And everything's there for a purpose. It does the job. So there you go, guys. That's my take on tench fishing, really. Like I said at the beginning, most of the time these days I'm fishing low-stocked gravel pits. Not a lot of fish in them, and location really is the key. I've got 100% confidence really in the rigs and baits that I'm using. I know that if I can get them in the right place, I'll catch fish. I'm not looking to get loads of bites, but hopefully once or twice a season I might catch a decent one. And that's the secret really to catching big tench, being on the right waters and using these simple tactics. So I hope that's inspired you to go out and give it a go. Thanks very much for watching, and see you again soon.